Well, thank you very much. I haven't actually seen how this works yet, but let's hope. Okay. One of the unifying things about all the simulations of future climate change is that while the means are tending to increase, the most important manifestation is that the fluctuations are going to become more intense. And my presentation is about an extreme drought that has recently occurred in a small reserve in northern KZN. Sure, what a strange thing. Can I operate it from here, rather? Sorry, I didn't have a practice session. Right, so I see this as a global warming prelude. I'm quite sure that we don't have anybody in this audience who doesn't believe in global warming like Donald Trump. I've got a simple talk. What was the super drought? What did the vegetation look like before and during the drought? How did it affect the plants? How did it affect the birds? Were there other observed effects? And the implications for the future. So what was the super drought? Well, these are the rainfall records. We run a July to June rainfall season. And you can see that the last three seasons, 2014, 2015, 2015-16, and 2016-17, were the lowest three on record. But that actually was only because that data was between, why did that not show? No. Yeah, that's because those rainfall data were only summarized up to mid-February 2017. Things were absolutely desperate. 3 of the worst consecutive rain seasons. But then, fortunately, we had some good rains in March to May, and that made all the difference, and it's going to change the whole effects of the super drought. Now, if you look at calendar year rainfalls, you can't see any obvious trend in terms of long-term changes in the mean. It's just very up and down. But the one thing that is certain, and all the farmers in the area have confirmed it, 2015 in terms of calendar years was the lowest rainfall in 100 years or more. I managed to get hold of one long-term rainfall series. It was lucky. I got it actually from my urologist when I went to visit him. It's a strange place where you get your data. But he gave me this data series from the Umhlathuze Sugar, and it's the April-May annual rainfalls. It's 150 kilometers south of Kubiyeni, so hardly absolutely identical. But the interesting thing is, there is actually a downward trend in the mean. It's about a 13% reduction over this period. But a much more worrying manifestation, as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that we had these 3 seasons, in fact 4, including the latest one here, which were very below average. This is the super drought. So what did the vegetation look like? That's what it looked like, just a random picture, July 2013. This is a man-induced grassland up on the top of the Lubombo Mountains. That's what it looked like in July 2014. You see the grass almost as high as the shoulders of the Nyala. June 2015, things are beginning to look pretty sparse. Grass sward really thinning out. January 2016, this is meant to be when half the rain season has occurred. This is how it looked all over the reserve. These are not the same places, these are far apart. July 2016 still. By July 2016, we were having to keep the remaining grazing mammals alive by bringing in fodder from the Midlands. And that is despite the fact that we'd done massive removals, removing more than 50% of all our grazing animals. By October 2016, the situation still hadn't improved. But fortunately, as I said to you, in the last part of that rain season, we got reasonable rains, and the system basically started to recuperate. But it's looking very scruffy, an enormous amount of acacia scrub coming into it. So how did it affect the plants? Well, the most important effect is that about 95 to 98% of all the perennial grass tufts died. An absolutely phenomenally serious impact, because that, of course, influences soil erosion rates, and it is probably the worst impact of the whole super drought. I did some studies when I was a felt researcher in Zimbabwe, and I marked certain grass tufts, and we followed their survival through about 5 years, and we computed the half-life of these different grass species was in excess of 100 years. So you mustn't think the perennial grass tufts, just because they lay on the ground, aren't important. They are very important, and they should live for a very long time. The other thing that happened on our reserve was that our rivers didn't run for 2 years, and it's apparent that riparian trees require water coming down the rivers to keep them alive. And the dominant tree on our rivers was the robust acacia, Acacia robusta, and it died in huge numbers. Probably 90% of the large individuals died. The picture on the left is tambuti trees, which once again one tends to think live forever, but we've had large stands of tambuti on our riverine alluvia dying in the super drought. Also sycamore figs. And the interesting thing is that our northern boundary is the Umsunduzi River, which rises some distance to the west of us. And while we were drought-stricken, we used to watch with horror as the thunderstorms fell on the Magut Hills, which fed this river. And so that river flowed several times, and none of the trees along those rivers, that Umsunduzi River, have died, whereas our rivers that we only rise on our game reserve have died in huge numbers. The other thing that happened was up on the ridgetop, we had evergreen trees like this. This is a Maetienus undata, and it just died. It just died with its leaves on. This is in June 2015. You can see it is quite general. A number of these trees that normally are green throughout the whole of the season and then just shed just before spring. They just died with their leaves on them. It's almost as though they were Phytophthora killed. That's what you see in the fynbos. Now that's going back to that exact identical picture. And if you look in that picture, you'll see there's a big tree in the foreground with a straight stem. And if you look at it in November this year, it's dead. That is the marula tree, and behind it, all of those trees that had turned brown, the vast majority of them have either died completely or died very severely into their canopies. And these large marulas died all over the ridgetop. You know, there were marulas that had, I don't know why they had generated in these rocky ridges, but they were extremely severely affected. And that's very important because they're one of the keystone species. Down on our rivers, the fever trees died in huge numbers as well. I would say most probably 80 to 90% of our fever trees have died. And up on the ridge, you heard just now in the mangroves how they regenerate as cohorts. Well, the cohort that had occurred on our ridge tops was Acacia nilotica, the scented pod acacia. And I'm just going to show you some pictures. This whole first cohort of Acacia niloticas that had formed these woodlands. And by the way, they were beginning to die and to be replaced by evergreen plants, which is the natural succession. But this whole cohort just died en masse in the drought. It was quite amazing to witness it. Now, I just had a big back operation, so I was able to walk around at my leisure in October of 2016, and I measured all the Alomolothii on the artificially cleared areas, which are called grassveld, and also in the bushveld. I measured them with my walking stick, and I could then compute what the total height of the plant was, whether it was dead or alive. And that was the results I got. 40% had died in the bushveld, where obviously moisture competition was intense with the other woody plants, and about 10% had died in the grassveld. But the interesting thing was that the aloe mortality was very skewed by height, with all of the big plants over 2.5 meters in height virtually dying, something like 50% of them anyway. And the worst thing is that in the bushveld habitat, no regeneration whatsoever. And I assure you, I didn't miss any of them, because there was no cover, so you could see even a little 20 centimeter high seedling. So the future of the Alomolothii on Kubieni and the bushveld areas looks very bleak. Now, how did it affect the birds? We've got lots of bird watchers amongst our shareholders. So we have all of them computing lists, and Digby Cyrus, who's one of our shareholders, great birder, he collates all these bird lists, so I'm able to say what happened. And all of these species that were really representative of more forested ecosystems, like that white-haired barbet and this golden-rumped tinkerbird, they just all moved out of the system. Some are high-rainfall seed-eaters, mainly typical of more moist ecosystems, only sort of marginally present in Kubieni, they also disappeared. Another high-rainfall species was the Brimstone Canary, and that was lost to the system as well. But most probably the most important and interesting change was what I call a switcheroo, because in our derived grasslands, this yellow-throated longclaw, which had been one of our dominant species, just absolutely died out. In fact, the last place I ever saw one was in August 2016, and I photographed it, and you can see it was in a little patch of dead grass that had been left over from previous seasons, and this species obviously requires tall grass as a sort of a refuge. But most of the reserve, unfortunately, at that stage was looking like that, and that certainly wasn't yellow-throated longclaw habitat. But what happened was that a bare ground specialist, the African pipit, moved in to take its place. So you had what I call the switcheroo. And the complete changeover from yellow-throated longclaws to African pipits is well exemplified by the percentage frequency of lists generated by one of our very keen bird watchers, Dr. Ray Berard. And it shows that the species which had basically been present on 100% of the lists in the ordinary years, yellow-throated longclaws, disappeared entirely in 2017, and the pipits took over in its place. I decided to see whether this was possibly just a figment of Ray Berard's imagination. So he had generated, I think it is 53 lists, so I took 292 lists from other people, a much longer time series from 1990 onwards, and it showed the exact same switcheroo. The yellow-throated longclaws, which had been one of the dominant components of our avifauna, moved out completely. The common francolin, the only francolin that was common on the reserve when I got there in 2006, and had been very common right up to the Super Drought, basically disappeared totally. Ray Berard managed to still get it on 50% of his lists, but I think he has very good ears, and he was hearing birds calling from Mkuzi Game Reserve to our north. The other resident game bird is the crested guinea, and normally they produce about 5 youngsters in their broods. Well, they produced only 1 in that particular brood. And the generalization that emerges is that it is bird species that are mainly dependent on the herbaceous layer, either for food or cover, that are most seriously affected. And I looked at the very diverse community of waxbills to see how it would actually manifest itself. Now, we've got a number of different species, and you don't have to try and work out which is which, but the crucial thing to look at is that in the super drought year of 2016, which was when it really manifested itself, you get this. Only three species persisted. The red column is the characteristic wax bill of our game reserve, the pink-throated twin spot, and the Melba finch, the little green bar, and then the blue bar is the blue wax bill. And those two, the latter two, are dry country species. There's our pink-throated twin spot, very common before, and now he's virtually disappeared. But not all the changes were losses. We got new species on the reserve, never before recorded, wattle plovers. They actually came and bred on the reserve, and I assure you they hadn't been missed. There's no such thing as missing on Kubiyeni. We've got too many birders there. And another one that turned up, and once again, couldn't have been missed before, Rhetus helmetstrikes, and they persisted. Where they came from, heaven only knows. But the well-distributed rainfall in the late season in 2016-2017 has allowed all these seed eaters to recolonize, including the green twin spots, which are real forest indicators. And the Brimstone canaries, which had been completely lost from reserve, they emerged and came back and were very common again. But possibly the best result I can report is that the ones that are really important for Kubiyeni to conserve, the birds of the forests and woodlands that are so characteristic of the Lubombo mountain range, were able to weather this super drought. For example, the little Rudza palus was able to just stay right throughout the super drought, as was the yellow-spotted Nicator. So what were the other observed effects? Well, the reserve's large mammals have been severely affected. Just to show you, this is how the populations have been reduced. The baboon populations, which are shown by the red bars, haven't been removed. They've just simply died out. And the small antelope haven't been removed either. Common reedbuck disappeared totally. Waterbuck disappeared totally. And in fact, the last time I saw that lone waterbuck, he was grazing on the slopes of that rock, going for some of the last green grass that was growing up in those rocky crevices. Habitat more suited to a klipspringer than a waterbuck. Another amazing change in the ecology was these golden orb spiders, which had been absolutely abundant and characteristic, disappeared virtually entirely. I had about 50 webs around my lodge, and in the 2016 season, there was only one. And then maybe because there were no spider webs to catch them, but also because a huge profusion of herbs generated after the perennial grasses died out, we had a massive upsurge in butterflies. And then the termites were predated by, I think, an aardvark, but there were no efforts to rebuild the hives. And I think that it can only mean that the hives are either very weak or had actually died out. The same happened this September. Aardvark came onto the top of the ridge, and he went into the hives, but nothing rebuilt them. And as a result, there were no termite alate emergences at the start of this rain season. And that's a huge ecological blow to the entire ecosystem. Implications for the future? Well, the one reason for optimism is that these ecosystems have been through trials and tribulations for millennia, and they have an ability to bounce back. For example, October 2016, an identical picture in 2017, same time of the year. October 2016, October 2017. So there is a tremendous resilience in these ecosystems. But unfortunately, the long-term effects are going to be severe. They're going to be very difficult to assess. They're going to be very complicated. And it's going to take years to assess them. But the one thing that we have to be aware of is that global warming is already with us, and our reserves are going to have to actually withstand this, and it's going to be through very careful adaptive management that we manage to get through. Thank you very much.